In this lecture, we will examine human skeleton. Along with the major subdivision of the skeleton, you will learn names of the bones, structure of the human skeleton, and function of the bones. We will take a look at microscopic structure of the bone, and we will take a peek at some abnormal conditions of the backbone. The principal functions of vertebrate skeleton include support, well, it is our body framework, muscle attachment, protection, mineral storage, and production of blood cells. Also, a very small bones called ossicles play an important role in a sense of hearing. Perhaps you already know that we have endoskeleton, which is found inside protective covering of skin and muscles. Our skeleton is cushioned from breaks by layers of skin and muscles. If we had exoskeleton, we would look like butterflies or beetles or shrimps or crayfish. Yes, all these organisms have skeleton on outside of their body, not inside like we do. So we say they have exoskeleton. At birth, there are 270 and even more bones formed during childhood. With age, the number decreases as separate bones gradually fuse. The fusion of several bonds completed by the adolescence and the mid-20s, bringing about average adult number of 206. So there are 206 bones in your body and more than 600 muscles. The bones provide a framework for our body called skeleton. The connecting ligaments, tendons, and muscle allow you to smile, ground, walk, run, jump, twirl, dip, slide, glide, twist, and wiggle. Without the bones, your body will look like body of worm or jellyfish. Bones are living tissue, just as are other soft parts of the body. Bones have various shape and structures. There are the long bones, such as those of the arm and the leg, which are hollow and filled with marrow. These bones are levers, which the muscles move to enable us to walk and lift things. Then there are flat bones, such as those of the skull. Your ribs are also flat bones. The chief function of the flat bones is to protect internal organs. There are cuboidal bones. For example, carpal bones, also known as the wrist bones, are cuboidal bones since they have cube-like shape. Also, cuboidal bones connect the foot and the ankle. Sesamoid bones are small bones that are commonly found embedded within a muscle or tendon near joint surfaces. The largest sesamoid bone is patella, a kneecap. If bones do not fit any of the listed categories, we call them irregular bones. Examples are vertebra, sacrum, coccyx, temporal, sphenoid, ethmoid, zygomatic, maxilla, mandible, palatine, and hyoid bones. The vertebrate column or backbone is the key of the vertebrate skeleton. It is segmented, more or less flexible, arch rod flanked by axial musculature to which head is attached. It provides a protective bony tunnel for the spinal cord. And this is what we have in common with fish, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, the backbone. We are all vertebrates. We all belong to the phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata. Skeletons of all mammals are very similar. Each of the bone in your body is an individual organ with a specific functions. For example, let's take a look at the femur, also known as the thigh bone. It is the longest and strongest bone in your body. Without it, you will not be able to stand and move. The femur also supports lots of important muscles, tendons, ligaments, and parts of your circulatory system. The main function of the femur is weight bearing and stability of gait. We just mentioned the biggest bone in your body. But what is the smallest bone in your body? The smallest bone is a stapes, but it has a very important function in your body. It conveys sound vibrations. So the vibrations can enter the inner ear. It generates waves in the fluid of the inner ear. These waves are processed into a neural data to be transmitted to the brain via the nerves. Without this bone, you will be deaf. Now let's take a close look at the structure of the human skeleton. Let's together label each of the bone we can see on this diagram. On this diagram, you can clearly see a frontal bone. The frontal bone is one of the 8 bones that together form the cranium, otherwise known as the protective case of the brain. Maxilla is the upper jaw in most vertebrates. In humans, it is also forms part of the nose and eye socket. Another word for eye socket is orbit. The mandible, lower jaw, is the largest and the strongest bone in the human facial skeleton. It forms the lower jaw and holds the lower teeth in place. It is the only movable bone in the skull, discounting the ossicles in the middle ear. The clavicle is the bone that connects the breastplate, we call it sternum, to the shoulder. Another word for clavicle is a collarbone. The sternum or breastbone is a long, flat bone located in the central part of the chest. It connects to the ribs via cartilage and forms the front of the rib cage, thus helping to protect the heart, lungs, and major blood vessels from injury. Humerus is the only bone in the arm. It is located between your elbow and your shoulder. Its main function is to provide support for your shoulder and wide variety of movements for your arm. The radius or radial bone is one of the 2 largest bones of the forearm. Note that it extends from the lateral side of the elbow to the thumb side of the wrist and runs parallel to the ulna. The ulna is one of the 2 forearm long bones that in conjunction with the radius. There are 8 carpal bones in each hand. The carpal bones are bones of your wrist that connect the radial and ulnar bones of your forearm to the bases of the 5 metacarpal bones of your hand. The phalanges are the bones that make up your fingers of the hand and the toes of your foot. Let's examine the number of bones in human hand. There are 8 carpal bones, 5 metacarpal bones, and 14 phalanges. Again, there are 8 carpal bones, 5 metacarpal bones, and 14 phalanges. The tarsus is a cluster of 7 articulating bones in each foot. The metatarsal bones are the bones of your forefoot. There are 5 metatarsal bones. And again, in human foot, there are 7 tarsal bones, 5 metatarsal bones, and 14 phalanges. The pelvis is a basin-shaped structure that supports your spinal column and protects your abdominal organs. The coccyx, also known as a tailbone, is a small triangular bone remnant of our tailed ancestors. It is located at the bottom of the spine. The ischium is a paired bone of the pelvis that forms the lower and back part of your hip bone. And you already know that femur, also known as a thigh bone, is the longest and strongest bone in your body. The patella, also known as a kneecap, is a small bone located in front of the knee joint. The tibia, also known as a shin bone. The fibula is your calf bone. It is smaller of the 2 bones in your lower leg. It gives your calf structure and forms the top of your ankle. What else we didn't label? The answer is very obvious. Even those that never took biology course can answer this question. You are correct. Ribs. Most people are born with 12 ribs on each side of the body, making a total of 24 ribs. What you perhaps do not know is that there are two pairs of ribs which are not attached to the breastbone. They called floating ribs. Our skeleton and skeletal of other mammals consist of four boxes. And that is cranium of skull, spinal column, thorax, and pelvis. Cranium of skull protects the brain. Vertebrae are the 33 individual interlocking bones that form the spinal column. The spinal column protects the spinal cord. The thorax, which are composed of sternum, rib cage, and part of vertebra, protects heart, lungs, liver, and spleen. Another box, pelvis, is sort of an open box. It provides support for the intestines and also contains the urinary bladder and reproductive organs. In human skeleton and skeleton of other mammals, there are two major subdivisions, and that is axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. In the human skeleton, axial skeleton consists of 80 bones and is composed of 6 parts. The skull, 22 bones, also the ossicles of the middle ear and hyoid bone, the thorax, sternum, and the vertebral column. On this slide, I only indicated ossicles and hyoid bone. You should have no problem to find the rest of the bone structures. The hyoid bone is located in the front of the neck just below the low jaw, carrying the weight of the tongue and playing a vital role in speech and swallowing. At birth, the hyoid bone made up of 3 unconnected bones. Over the time, these bones may or may not fuse to form crescent-shaped structure. The bones outside of the axial skeleton are part of the appendicular skeleton, from the Latin word meaning to hang upon. The shoulder blades, collarbone, arm, hip, and leg bones are part of the appendicular skeleton. These bones usually play a role in body movements. The axial skeleton together with the appendicular skeleton form the complete skeleton. Now let's take a close look at the skull, thoracic cage, vertebra, and pelvic bones. First, we will have to look at the bones of the skull. You will have to pay close attention to the names of the bones. Try to pronounce each name. In fact, if you will not practice their pronunciation, you will easily forget their names, and you will struggle when we will cover later on central nervous system. In the skull, bones are connected to each other by fibrous bands of tissue called cranial sutures. Cranial sutures are a good example of immovable joints. Bones of the skull form a box which encloses and protects the brain. In very young human and animal, cranial sutures have not closed completely, and therefore room is left for growth. Thus, in a baby, one finds a soft spot on the top of the head. Another word for a soft spot is fontanelle. This space is often not entirely closed with bone until the child is 2 years old. The first bone that we will look at is easy to remember and identify. It is the frontal bone, a forehead bone. The frontal bone is one of the 8 bones that together form the cranium. The primary functions of the frontal bone are to protect the brain and support the structures of the head, such as nasal passages and eyes. The parietal bones are 2 bones in the skull which form the sides and the roof of the cranium. Sphenoid bone is a regular bone that forms central part of the floor of the cranium, behind the eyes and below the front part of the brain. It has 2 pairs of broad lateral wings and a number of other projections and contains 2 air-filled sinuses. The entire sphenoid resembles a big-eared bat in flight. The ethmoid bone is an unpaired, complicated bone in the skull that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. It is located at the roof of the nose between the two orbits. The irregular bone is lightweight due to a spongy construction. The ethmoid bone is one of the bones that make up the orbit of the eye, nasal cavity, and septum, a portion separating two chambers. The entire bone is not visible. Only specific portion of it can be seen, which makes it difficult to visualize how it fits into the skull. The lacrimal bone is a small and fragile bone of the facial skeleton. It is roughly the size of the little fingernail. It helps form medial wall of eye socket and side wall of nasal cavity. The zygomatic bones are more commonly known as the cheekbones. These two bones are located just below each eye and extend upward to the outer side of each eye. The zygomatic bones join the several other bones of the face, including the nose, jaw, portion of the eye socket, and bones just in front of the ears. The nasal bones are two small bones varying in size and form in different individuals. They are placed side by side at the middle and upper part of the face, and by their junction form bridge of the nose. The maxilla is bone that forms your upper jaw. The right and left halves of the maxilla are bones that fuse together in the middle of the skull, below the nose, in an area known as the intermaxillary suture. Vomer is a small, thin bone separating the left and right nasal cavities. Inferior to the maxilla is the mandible, a lower jaw. It is the largest and strongest bone in the human skull and the only one that can move noticeably. It holds the lower teeth in place and it assists in mastication, that is chewing. I almost forgot to mention the temporal bones, a paired bones that help make up the sides and base of the skull. They protect the part of the brain and surround the ear canal. Here is the side view of the skull. The view allows you to see occipital bone, a bone that forms the back and base of the skull and through which the spinal cord passes. Another bones that could not be seen in our previous diagrams are two palatine bones or palatine bones. Both pronunciations are correct. They are located between the maxilla and the sphenoid bone. They participate in building the three cavities within the skull: the oral cavity, nasal cavity, and orbits. Your sternum, a breastbone, along with the ribs, works to protect the organs of your torso, such as heart, lungs, liver, and blood vessels. It consists of manubrium, body, and xiphoid process. Thoracic cage has an inverted cone shape. Sternum connects the ribs via costal cartilages. Your sternum also provides the connection point for your collarbone and most of your ribs. Sternum and ribs serve as an attachment point for many muscles and are active during respiration. Another important function of sternum and ribs, blood formation. This is where a lot of your blood is made. There are 12 pairs of ribs with no differences between sexes. Rib 1 through 7 called true ribs because each has its own costal cartilaginous connection to the sternum. Rib 8 through 10 are called false ribs because they lack independent cartilaginous connections to the sternum. They are connected to the sternum indirectly. 11 and 12 are called floating ribs because they do not have any cartilaginous connections to the sternum. Among the Japanese and some other people, rib 10 is also usually floating. Because of their features, the ribs could have more specific names. True ribs could be called vertebrosternal ribs. False ribs could be called vertebrochondrial ribs. And floating ribs could be called vertebral ribs. The vertebral column in humans, allowing some variation in coccyx, consists of about 33 bones. Note that there are 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 sacral vertebrae, and 3 or 4 vertebrae in the coccyx. In the newborn, spine exhibits one continuous C-shaped curve, as it does in monkeys, apes, and most other four-legged animals. As the infant begins to crawl and lift its head, the cervical region becomes curved towards the back, enabling an infant on its belly to look forward. As the toddler begins walking, another curve develops in the same direction in the lumbar region. The resulting S-shape makes sustained bipedal walking possible. The thoracic and pelvic curvatures are called primary curvatures because they were there from birth. The cervical and lumbar curvatures are called secondary curvatures because they develop later in the child's first year of crawling and walking. Major parts of the pelvis are ilium, sacrum, coccyx, and ischium. The pelvis is the most sexually dimorphic part of the skeleton, that is, the one whose anatomy most differs between the sexes. In identifying the sex of the skeletal remains, forensic scientists focus especially on the pelvis. The average male pelvis is more robust, heavier and thicker than the female, owing to the forces exerted on the bone by stronger muscles. The female pelvis is adapted to the needs of pregnancy and childbirth. It is wider and shallower and has a larger pelvic inlet and outlet for passage of the infant's head. In males, pelvic inlet is heart-shaped, sacrum is narrower and longer, coccyx less movable and more vertical. Now let's take a look at the microscopic structure of the bone. The matrix of bone is composed of organic materials of collagen, proteins, proteoglycans, and water, which impart flexibility, and inorganic phosphate and calcium mineral salts, which provide firmness. Without the addition of mineral, bone would have properties similar to a rubber band, while without collagen, bone is brittle like chalk. Minerals thus straighten the bone, whereas collagen allows flexibility. In terms of microelements, composition of the bone is unique to each individual and depends on the places one is raised. On 2001, the torso of a young boy was discovered in the River Thames near Tower Bridge in central London. It seems that boy was part of religious sacrifice. Dubbed Adam by police officers, the unidentified remains belong to a black male around 4 to 8 years old. Having just torso of the child, police were not able to establish identity of the boy, so they turned to the scientists for help. Simply by the composition of the bone, scientists were able to trace a small village in Africa where the boy was born and raised. Many people got in trouble for human trafficking during this investigation. However, it took decades to find out what really happened. You can Google the story on the net. I brought this story to your attention to demonstrate how unique the composition of bone matrix may be. Bone matrix is organized into numerous structural units called Haversian systems. Haversian system is a structural and functional unit of a bone. Each circular and tube-like Haversian system is composed of multiple layers of calcified matrix arranged in layers resembling the rings of an onion. Each ring of the bone is called concentric lamella. Bone cells called osteocytes emerge in heart matrix. Osteocytes have their own offices called lacunae. They give commands what to do to other bone cells such as osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Eventually, those cells mature and also become osteocytes. But they have to do a lot of manual work before this happens. Let's make diagram of Haversian system. First, we will draw a central canal that contains blood vessel. Here it is. Easy thing to do. Now we will draw a ring of calcified matrix called concentric lamella. Then we will draw more of these rings one after another. Now we will draw lacunae, which contains bone cells called osteocytes, along with the small canals that bring oxygen and nutrients to the bone cells. These canals called canaliculi. Canaliculi connect each lacuna with central canal. Through canaliculi, bone cells get oxygen, nutrients, vitamins, and minerals. On this slide, you see everything had been labeled. This is an osteono-Haversian system, a structural and functional unit of the bone tissue. Osteono-Haversian system have tubular structure, so the bone tissue is the collection of these tubes all held together. What we draw here is only one of these tubes. And here is central canal, concentric lamellae, lacunae, with osteocyte and canaliculi. Canaliculi system of the transport. Note that AE on the end of the word represent the nominative plural case in Latin. Singular, lamellae, lamella, plural, lamellae, lamella, lamellae. Here on the left, you see an image of Haversian system or osteon under the microscope. Magnification 100x. And on the right, you see our drawing of it. If you want to emphasize the tubular structure of Haversian system, you might want to draw two lines downwards. Now let's label the microscopic image. Here are lacunae. Here the central canal, here canaliculi, and last but not the least, the structures where we find all of this, the structures called concentric lamellae, which is onion-like rings of calcifying bone matrix. One of the bone function is mineral storage. Think of a bone as a bank account where you deposit and withdraw bone tissue. In childhood and teenage age, new bone is added to the skeleton faster than old bone is removed. As a result, bone becomes larger, heavier, and denser. For most people, bone formation continues at faster pace than removal until bone mass peaks during the third decade of life. After age 20, withdrawals can begin to exceed deposits. For many people, this bone loss can be prevented by taking in calcium, vitamin D, and exercise, and by avoiding tobacco and excessive alcohol use. Osteoporosis develops when bone removal occurs too quickly, replacement occurs too slowly, or both. Osteoporosis causes bone to become weak and brittle, so brittle that a fall or even mild stress such as bending over or coughing can cause fractures. Osteoporosis-related fractures most commonly occur in the hip, wrist, or spine. You are more likely to develop osteoporosis if you did not reach your maximum peak bone mass during your bone building years. This is why if you started drinking and smoking before 20 years old, you might pay for this with sometimes life-threatening bone fractures when you become 50, 60, or 70. Another problem that some people have with the skeletal system is abnormal spinal curvatures. Scoliosis is a sideways curvature of the spine. While scoliosis can occur in people with conditions such as cerebral palsy and muscular dystrophy, the cause of mass childhood scoliosis is unknown. It can affect people of any age, from babies to adults, but most often starts in children aged 10 to 15. Scoliosis can improve with treatment, but it is not usually a sign of anything really serious, and treatment is not always needed if it is mild. Signs of scoliosis include a visibly curved spine, leaning to one side, uneven shoulders, one shoulder or hip sticking out, the ribs sticking out on one side, and as a result, clothes not fitting well. Kyphosis is an exaggerated forward rounding of the back. It is occur at any age, but is most common in older women. Age-related kyphosis is often due to weakness of the spinal bones that causes them to compress or crack. Other type of kyphosis can appear in infants or teens due to malfunction of the spine or wedging of the spinal bones over time. Lordosis is an excessive inward curvature of the spine. Lordosis might be associated with poor posture and congenital problems with the vertebra, neuromuscular problems, back surgery, pelvis or hip problems. Now let's check if you were able to follow me. What you see here as a diagram is a side view of a backbone. So what condition is this? Kyphosis. How about this condition? What you see is the back view of the backbone or vertebra. Scoliosis. What condition is this? Again, you see the side view of the vertebra. Lordosis, correct. The skeletal system as a whole includes not only bones, but also related tissues such as cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. Together, they make up 20% of your total body weight. They provide the body with a rigid framework for support and protection. Every bone in the body, except one, connects to at least one other bone. In other words, every bone but one forms a joint with some other bones. Should I give you time to think which other bone that doesn't have connection with any other bones? The exception, of course, is the hyoid bone in the neck, to which the tongue anchors. Joints perform two functions. They hold our bones together securely, and at the same time, they make it possible for movements to occur between bones, between most of them, that is. Without joints, we could not move our arm, legs, or any other of our body parts. Our body would be, in short, be rigid, immobile hulks. Most of us probably never think about our joints unless something goes wrong with them and they do not function properly. Then their tremendous importance becomes painfully clear. Arthritis is the swelling and tenderness of one or more joints. The main symptoms of arthritis are joint pain and stiffness, which typically worsens with age. Now, question again. To review what we just said, what are the organs of the skeletal systems? Bones and joints, of course. What are the functions of the skeletal system? You're right if you say support, protection of soft tissue, mineral storage, blood formation, and transmitting sounds to the inner ear. What is the bone in the skull through which the spinal cord passes? Occipital bone. If you thought of occipital bone, you are absolutely right. Next question. Can you define cranial suture? Fibrous joints between skull bones. That is a correct answer. That's what cranial sutures are. Fibrous joint between skull bones. The next question. Excluding the vertebral column, what are the major components of the thorax? You are right if you right away said ribs and sternum. Can you give examples of long bones? Femur, fibula, tibia, humerus, ulna, radius, metacarpals, phalanges, metatarsals. All of these bones are examples of long bones. Can you give example of irregular bones? The irregular bones are vertebra, sacrum, coccyx, temporal, sphenoid, ethmoid, zygomatic, maxilla, mandible, palatine, and hyoid bones. Now I want you to go through the lecture writing your own list of questions. It is always helpful in studying of a new topic. Our next lecture is going to be on muscular system.